Hey everybody, welcome back to New Digs, and it's still early spring here in Northwest Connecticut, which means that this season at least, it's still chilly, which is why I'm wearing a down vest on the Monday after Mother's Day weekend. And that brings us to a concept that we talked about briefly in a previous video, which is the last frost-free date. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the last date that we expect to get a killing frost, a cold frost, in our geographical area. The reason that's important is because while perennials, plants that come back every year, will come back in the garden on their own time, many of us gardeners want to get annual containers out. The annuals are the ones we think of when we think of the beautiful flower pot on the deck or the hanging basket that we give to Mom for Mother's Day. Those are annuals, and they're flowers that bloom for one whole season. Meaning basically from the last frost-free date all the way through, usually in this area, October. So today I want to talk to you about choosing annuals for an early spring container, and then how I might be adjusting some of those plants a little bit later on when the weather warms up. So I want to remind you, lest you have forgotten, that I do work at a local garden center, and before I moved to my new digs here, I managed a garden center in northern Westchester for about 11 years, and I did all the ordering there. What that means is that from experience, I know what plants growers make available very early in the season because they're the most cold tolerant. So I have experience. But in addition, these plants have tags in them and the tags are going to have information about how much light a plant needs, and relevant to our discussion, what kind of temperatures they can take. Some things are super sensitive to cold, so they're not going to work for me in an early spring container. But other plants do perfectly fine with temperatures even below 40 degrees, 35 degrees, and oftentimes that'll be indicated on the tags. And if you're shopping at a garden center, especially a local garden center with knowledgeable local gardeners running the place, just ask them if a plant, if they've had success, or if they know if a plant has worked in an early spring container before the last frost-free date. Now, as gardeners, we like to experiment. Sometimes, we'll start very early in the spring because we're just dying to get some color in the garden. And I actually have had a container out for over a month now. Remember, it's early May. I would say I've had it out for a good 5 weeks. And that container is filled with glorious little violas, also called Johnny Jump Ups. And one of the first things you'll see available are pansies and Johnny Jump Ups. You'll even see them. They may have a second flush of bloom in the late fall. You can even see them in December, still blooming with little bits of snow around them. So pansies and violas are super hardy. And the container that I made early this spring is a very simple one. It's violas, and then I have a perennial plant in there, a hellebore, which is also one of the first plants, perennial plants, to bloom in the garden. So I just made a fun little combination. And again, it's been on my deck for a month on my porch, and I would anticipate that those violas are probably going to continue at least through June, assuming we don't get a real hot snap. So now let's talk about plant selection. We've already talked about those little Johnny Jump Ups that worked beautifully in my very early spring container, but now what can I do in an early spring container? And I took a chance about a week ago. I really jumped the gun, frankly, and decided that I was going to try to put some plants that I had seen at my nursery to work in a container here at my house. And I have been covering this in the evening when the night temperatures have been dropping below 40. It's been about 37 here. But even without the cover, I actually forgot to leave it on last night, and even without the cover, these guys did great. I'm also sitting here, you can see I have a group of 3 containers, 3 different sizes that came as a set. And they're going to stay together. They're going to be positioned together once they get planted. So I'm also thinking not just about what to put in each individual pot, but how I'm going to coordinate the 3 in terms of repeating some plants, but having some alternatives, and maybe even putting, since this pot is so large, maybe even putting a perennial or 2 in this pot. So I want to think about color, I want to think about height, and I need to think about light. This is a full sun area in my garden. It is out near my driveway, so it's a very hot, later in the season it's going to be a very hot site for these plants. I want to just give you a little sidebar about containers that you're going to use in the garden. One of the most important things is that the container you're using has a hole in the bottom, has a drainage hole. Plants, for the most part, do not want to sit in a swampy, watery mess for the entire season. So it's really important to either buy one that has a drainage hole in it, or you can just take a drill and drill a couple of simple holes, but that drainage is really, really important. Soil is also important. Many people ask, well, why do I have to buy soil? Why can't I just dig soil out of my garden, out of my yard, and throw it in here? The short answer is you probably could, but you're going to get much better results with a high quality potting soil. And you can buy potting soils. I know Miracle Grow, for example, makes one that has food in it. Because Jill and I don't garden, we try not to garden with a lot of chemicals. We try to garden largely organically. I don't necessarily recommend the soils that have food already in them. The product that I like the best, and it's a little plug for the coast of Maine, this is their organic potting soil. This is their container mix. It's made specifically to go in containers. They have other blends of soil, peat, humus, various things like that for other applications, but it's really good to get a soil that's specifically designed to go in containers. Container Design 101. You generally want 3 types of plant material in the container. You want what they call a spiller, you want something in the middle that's called a filler, and you want something tall in the back, and that's called the thriller. So you've got your thriller, your filler, and your spiller. And the idea is that it just makes the container look fuller. So as I design this much larger container, I want to be thinking about those principles. Because this is so big too, and I may not want to spend as much money buying a bunch of annuals that will go only for one season, I may want to consider putting some perennials in here, plants that will come back in my garden every year. And I often do that in containers because I think it gives me more bang for the buck. Plus, many perennials have great leaf color, so that I can get some aesthetic value out of them as well as financial benefits. So I've got a couple of things here. This plant is one of my favorites. This is a Tiarella, and as delicate as this looks, this is a super hardy woodland plant. It's got great purple color on the leaves. It's also called foam flower. That's one of its common names. It actually has a beautiful fragrance, a very light fragrance. So this in your woodland garden is a plant that I can't recommend highly enough. This is the second one. Looks kind of similar. This is called a Heuchera. And if you've been watching any gardening shows, you know that there's been a boom in breeding these new cultivars of these plants the last few years. All different colors, all different sizes. The main thing that you grow a Heuchera for is the leaf color. They do have a flower. It's very insignificant, not super interesting. Its common name is the coral bell, but you're really growing this for the foliage. And the reason I chose it is because I wanted to pick up that purple. If I have an all-time favorite annual plant, it is this. This is called a black and blue salvia. And it has this beautiful, almost minty scent to it. But what you grow this for is it's going to give you height. It's a very stately plant. This thing can get up to 3 feet. I've actually had it, if I've planted it directly in the ground, I've had this plant reach up to 4 feet in one growing season. It's also got these great black stems. And I don't know if you can see, we'll show you the tag in a little bit of a close-up, but it has the most glorious gentian blue flower that, believe it or not, attracts hummingbirds. This, in my garden, pulls in more hummingbirds than anything else that I grow. So I always have this in my containers, and because I like the combination of orange and blue, this is always going to be a key player in my orange containers. Now, the trick here is that I said this thing gets very tall by the end of the season. It's not there yet. It's obviously shorter than either of these two. However, because I want that height in the back of the container, I'm going to plant it in the back. So for a few weeks, my container is going to look a little bit odd because I'm going to have this short thing in the back and these kind of hunkering things in the front. But trust me, we'll show you a picture later in the season when my black and blue has really come into its own. And you'll see what I mean about how statuesque it is. And in fact, even though these plants can get to be nice and big, they can form a pretty large clump. Virgil the peacock, again, agrees. I'm going to use two. I'm going to use two of these in my container because I really want a big, big clump. In addition, if I decide later in the season that this Tiarella, because it's a spring plant, so this is really its time, if it starts to get a little bit burned out, because remember, this is hot sun, this is a woodland plant, in July, my Tiarella may not be happy here. I can pull it out, put it in a woodland spot in the garden, and I still have my two large black and blue salvias in the back so that its absence will barely be missed. So you have to think in terms of that too if you're going to use some perennials in a container. So now I've got some key elements for my pot. I've got the Tiarella, got the Heuchera, and I've got my black and blue salvia. Now it's time to think about more of those filler elements. And I want some color right away. So I'm going to use these cute little guys, and they are an early spring annual. They come in shades of purples, pinks, oranges. And while they don't do great in a single pot like this, once they get in the soil, they really tend to mound up. I know that they're super cold hardy. I have one in here, and it's been doing fine. So I'm strongly considering that. This is a Verbena, and anybody who's done any digging around in a garden center has probably seen these. They often will trail. This particular one is a little bit more upright, but they come in amazing shades, and I just think that the little purple petals with the white center is going to be very stunning. And finally, and this one might surprise you, especially given its name, this is called an African daisy, or an Osteospermum. This is probably one of the earliest plants that you'll see in garden centers. It looks very tropical. Right now, it's a bit of a chilly day, so its petals, it actually opens and closes its petals based on how sunny and warm it is. So the plant's a little chilly right now, so it's kind of pulled into itself. I'm ready to plant. Got my two perennials here, and people often ask, how do you get things out of a container? Well, what I do is just give it a good squeeze, and typically the plant will come right out. This, we said, remember, was a perennial, and this is the sign of a good root system. The roots are not wound around and choking the plant to death, so this is good. And I can even, and I frequently do this, pull some of this off the bottom just to loosen the plant up and give it more contact, give the roots it has more contact with the soil in my pot. I've already put the soil in. One reason that I'm planting this pot here in situ, in place, is because it is super heavy. Some people with a large pot like this will put styrofoam in the bottom. They'll put empty plant pots in the bottom just to take up some volume, so that you're not using as much soil, and so that the planter isn't as heavy. I like to fill it with soil and leave it in situ because I think it gives more soil for the roots to work with. So I've got my Heuchera, gonna pop out my Tiarella, same thing, pop it out. Another nice root system, not pot bound. Gonna pull this off. You can also, and some people do this, take a pair of pruners or a knife and just score the sides. Because what you're trying to do, as we said, is get those roots to get as much surface area in contact with the soil as possible so that they start to dig in. Okay, I'm going to put this here. I'm just going to lay them out first before I actually plant them, just to see what I'm thinking. Got my two salvias, and notice this is an annual. You notice the difference in the root system here. This has been grown at the grower to grow quickly, and so it's probably been fed with a lot of plant food to get it to grow quickly so that it's ready for the garden centers. I'm going to stick those back here. Then I'm going to think about what to put in the front. I know I want my African daisy. I think that's going to go here. I think I'm going to put one of these to coordinate, because remember I said that I wanted to think about these three planters as a group. So I want to repeat something that's already in here. Put that here. And then I think I have room, given the Tiarella, I might have room for two more. Plants. I do tend to stuff my containers. Some people are a little more patient than I am, and so will not use as much plant material. But I like to stuff them, and especially since I may be pulling a couple of these out if they start to wilt later in the summertime when it gets really hot. Because remember, these are very cold hardy and more heat sensitive, strangely enough, plants. So I think, try to put my Verbena in over here. And this last little plant is one that I didn't talk about. This is a sweet potato vine. And these guys are kind of everywhere these days. You see them in containers because once it's warm enough for them, they're super hardy. They grow quickly and they'll trail down the side. They come in chartreuse and purples. This one even has a little chartreuse on the bottom of the leaf, which I think will pull in beautifully with this. However, I looked on the tag for this guy, and unfortunately it says he is not going to be happy. He's happy to 45 degrees. It's going to be 37 tonight. I'm not going to risk putting him in the container only to have it get burned in the cold. This plant might survive even if it gets cold and gets nipped by the cold. But remember, we had that concept of thriving. It's not going to look good. And by the time it gets its wits about it again and starts to look good, I've already wasted several weeks of it being in the container. So I think it's better. I'm going to plant everything up except for this, and then I can pop this in a couple of weeks when it's warm enough, and we'll be good to go. So let me show you how to pop this up. First, the Tiarella, since this is kind of the largest piece of plant material that I have, and I'm burying it. People always ask me, how deeply do you plant something? The general answer is you plant it to where it was in the pot. There are a couple of exceptions with some vegetables, and we'll talk about that later. But for the most part, plant things to right the level of soil was in the pot. So let me put my black and blue salvias, again, give those a little rip in the back. As I said, I'm putting 2 in, so it's going to be a very dramatic backdrop for the rest of the container. Okay, next. And the leaf color of this, I think you'll see it having that contrast so that everything isn't green. It's not just flowers. You really are growing things for texture and color as well as just the blooms. And I think that's an important concept when you're doing containers. You want things to look at besides just the color. Okay. Then I like my Osteospermum. I think I'm going to put him here. I'd initially thought there. I'm going to pull some roots off. Osteospermum, snuggled up with the Salvia in the back. Now I'm going to imagine that I'm seeing this pot from the front. And so I'm going to put my spiller kind of where the bee is, just to remind myself that I need to keep that space open. I'm going to put my little Verbena over here. Again, planting right to the level that the plant was in its pot, leaving my space. Pull this guy in. And you can plant things a little bit tipped. So while this tends to be quite upright, if I want it to spill a little bit, I just plant it on the side and it already disposes the plant to do that tipping thing. And I want to do that especially since I don't have my spiller in yet. So let's imagine you're going to be here, spilling gorgeously down the side like a waterfall. I fluff. I give this some water. Afterwards, my soil is quite moist already, but I'm still going to give it some water. And I may even put some plant food in the water. A product that I like to use is a fish and seaweed emulsion. It does not smell fabulous when you first use it, but it's great for any time you plant new things. It is organic. And it's really, not only does it feed the plants, it also almost inoculates them. It helps them with disease and hardiness. So we'll talk about different kinds of fertilizers in another video, but if I do feed it, that's probably what I will do. And to keep this guy blooming all summer, feeding it, probably once a week, depending on the product I'm using, is definitely recommended. So there's our container. We've got these two working together. At a later date, I'm going to work on this third one. I think I'm going to put something that's not at all cold tolerant in it. So I'm going to keep that open, keep my options open for the end of the month. Around Memorial Day is our last frost-free date.